have no rights. The universe is evil. Why do you think anything? You women are always complaining. Why don't you like us fascist men? Why don't you learn to shut up, stow away your grievances, learn the small details and particulars? You're too lonely. You can't stand it anymore. Your pain has no relation to anyone else's pain. So what? Learn the varieties of pain, watch your pain and grow up. This is taken from Kathy Acker's Blood, Guts in High School, because in this talk I want to speak to you about feminist literature of the 20th century. Primarily, I'll be discussing literature which is by women, about women, but for everyone. To quote US Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, "What I want young women and girls to know is, you are powerful, and your voice matters." Feminism as a movement aims to achieve true equality in society for women and redress the imbalance which exists within the patriarchy. In this vein, anyone who believes in equality is, by definition, a feminist. The 20th century saw some of the greatest advancements in the feminist movement, and much of that is thanks to the many feminist writers of the 20th century. Their words inspired and also raised awareness of the plight of women in the world. Without these brilliant writers, many women would have simply resigned themselves to being second-class citizens, and many wouldn't have realised what women actually had to deal with as a result of being born female. It's no greatly kept secret that women's writing has long since been a thorn in the side of the male literary establishment. From fears in the late 18th century that reading novels, particularly written by women, would be emotionally and physically dangerous for women, to the Bronte sisters publishing initially under male pseudonyms, to the dismissal of the genre of romantic fiction. There's been a dominant culture which finds the association of women and writing to be dangerous. It has for a long time been something to be controlled, managed and dismissed. However, how can women begin to escape the romance trap in literature? When will it become acceptable and satisfying for a happy ending to be more than just a rushed marriage? A question. Who makes the decision about which genres are deemed to be appropriate, and who decides which books are put into which category? Is it the publishing houses? The book editors? Or the agents of the authors themselves? The concept of genre itself is further complicated by the concept of women's writing. Can we have a genre that is designated solely by the sex of the author? What if we turn this around, and instead of a genre, women's writing was a term we use to simply celebrate writing about women? Often, popular novels by women have a narrative arc that is visible from the outset. The protagonist will find a romantic partner, and in the end, they will inevitably marry. After all, Bridget Jones's journey is about finding out which man is the yin to her yang. What unites many novels about women is an exploration of the choices that some women have to make as a result of their sexed and gendered embodiment. Sometimes, though, we get a glimmer of hope. Writing about women, and often by women, can give the reader some examples of how to challenge the patriarchal status quo, if only for a little while. Each challenge provides another example of how to effect change in a patriarchal culture. Although the idea of genre and labelling, as I've already mentioned, is problematic when it comes to feminist writing, there are key authors who form the 20th century feminist canon. Firstly, Betty Friedan, in her 1983 book The Feminine Mystique, discussed the problem that has no name. This problem was the burning question in the minds of many a suburban housewife as they cooked dinner, cleaned the house and chauffeured children to cubs and brownies. Is this all? Truly feminine women were taught to pity the neurotic, unfeminine, unhappy women who wanted to be poets or physicists or presidents. Concerned over the Soviet Union's lead in the space race, scientists actually noted that America's greatest source of unused brainpower was women. Friedan was also the head of the National Organization for Women, known by the appropriate acronym NOW, which was a politically active group responsible for perceived civil disobedience, the likes of which was discussed in Dorothy Bryant's pathetically harrowing novel, written in the form of a diary, Ella Price's Journal. NOW purported that their issues were not with men, just with society and the patriarchal structure. It was egalitarianism they wanted, not the supremacy of women. I'd like to nip back to the 19th century for a moment and mention Kate Chopin and her novel, The Awakening. Here, she effectively crafted the narrative of protagonist Edna Pontellier's conflict between individual autonomy and social conformity. Reviewers at the time of publication condemned Edna as weak, selfish, immoral, and most of them smugly gloated over her suicide. It seems maddening that almost a century later, the likes of Bryant in the aforementioned Ella Price's Journal were still battling with autonomy versus social conformity and felt the need to include the topic of suicide as a result of this battle, suicide being even more prolifically and poignantly discussed in Sylvia Plath's work. Heading back to the 20th century France, Simone de Beauvoir is perhaps one of the most famous feminist writers of the last century. Her works, which include titles like The Second Sex and She Came to Stay, often explored women's roles in society, and in them she called out the wicked double standards with which she grew up. She was also one of the first women who really pointed out how women were socialised to be women, and many girls, upon reading her writing, realised how many double standards tend to be present in modern society. However, in America, when The Second Sex was released, words like emancipation and career sounded strange and embarrassing because no one had used them for years. A critic commented that de Beauvoir obviously didn't know what life was about, as the identity of the housewife was so firmly branded into the psyche of women at the time. Virginia Woolf is one of the most widely read feminist writers of the last century. She's most well known for her stream of consciousness style of writing, as well as the fact that she regularly placed women at the forefront of her stories, which was a rarity at the time. Woolf was one of the first writers who brought a woman's inner life to the forefront, and was also one of the only women who noted that misogyny and militarism tend to go together. She was also one of the few women of her time to see gender as a fluid concept. Mrs. Dalloway and A Room of One's Own are a good place to start as an indicator of her style. I've mentioned her already, but Sylvia Plath was most famous for writing The Bell Jar and is regularly cited as one of the most influential female writers, despite being only 29 when she died. Her struggle with identity and what it meant to be female and feminine is prevalent through her poetry. Plath's hard-hitting novels don't only cover feminist social commentary, but also mental illness and many other topics that were completely taboo in her time. One could only imagine what she could have written had she not killed herself at a young age due to the abuse and philandering on the part of her husband, Ted Hughes. Finally, I'd like to mention Angela Carter, who's featured on the A-level specification for English literature, and therefore is known to many of you. She focuses mainly on sex, sexuality, and the way that people treated women who were openly sexual. She was one of the first women to peel back the pure and chaste veneer that society had in place for girls and question the angel in the house idea and embrace the brains instead of brooms mentality which existed in the last century. To conclude, so-called feminist literature, if it can and should be named as such, aims to revalue female experience and raise awareness of the situations of women. It is an ongoing journey of evolution from the archaic concept of the romance trap to self-definition and self-reliance in a man's world.